think it's great.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, we are now live. So good evening, everyone. My name is Dylan Hauser, and I serve as the Chief Advocacy Officer at the Israeli American Civic Action Network, or as our friends like to call us, ICAN. We are a movement of Israeli and American grassroots activists and leaders creating change for a better America, a more secure Israel, and a stronger U.S.-Israel alliance. I'm pleased to have with us here tonight Rhonda Lees from the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Rhonda, do you want to say a quick word about the AAJLJ?
I am happy to do so. So first of all, Dylan, thank you very much for inviting us to co-sponsor this with you. I'm excited to hear the number of our members who have been looking forward to hearing about this topic, upsetting as it is. AAJLJ is we're a human rights organization, and our motto, translated from the Hebrew, is justice, justice shall you pursue. And we have a lot of events and conferences to help our members and members of the community learn more about the topics of interest to us.
Great. Well, tonight we have an incredible program lined up with Grant Goshen and Sylvia Foti to discuss their story and how their family history has been intertwined for the last century through the Holocaust to today. But before we get to Grant and Sylvia, I'm very proud to bring on Alex Galitsky from the Armenian National Committee of America to discuss contemporary genocide denial. Let's bring in Alex. Alex.
Hi, Dylan and Rhonda. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to join this discussion on what is such an important issue and one that is so crucial to our understanding of international human rights and genocide prevention today. My name is Alex Galitsky. I'm the Communications Director of the Armenian National Committee Western Region. We represent the interests of the 1.5 million Armenian Americans that call the United States home and represent the cause for justice for the Armenian genocide, amongst other issues. So as a community, we're kind of well experienced when it comes to the scourge that is genocide and genocide denial that follows. I'm also leading an initiative called the Impact Media Institute, which is a new initiative launched by our organization to address the issue of genocide denial as it exists in the world today, along with contemporary genocide perpetration. So to get into the issue of genocide denial, I think it's best described and summarized in the words of Elie Wiesel, who described it as the second killing, a double killing of the community, wherein following the attempted physical extermination of a group, we see this process by which that group's memory and every other remnant of their existence is sought to be destroyed, whether that be their historic existence, their civilization, their culture. It's in fact one of the most pernicious and pervasive forms of genocide perpetration that exists in the world today. And I refer to it as a form of genocide because that's what the leading scholars in the field of genocide have referred to it as. Genocide denial is the final stage of genocide perpetration because it results in the erasure of the history of a community and a people who've been subject to this grave crime against humanity. And to kind of center the experience of the Armenian community as a representative of an organization that has long fought for justice for the Armenian genocide, we have as a community experienced 105 years now of genocide denial. Genocide denial that has not only resulted in an obscuring of the understanding of our community's suffering 105 years ago, where 1.5 million Armenians were killed at the hands of the Ottoman Turks, but we also see genocide denial manifest itself in many contemporary ways, many destructive ways, including the ongoing persecution of Armenian communities in Turkey today, in Azerbaijan, where anti-Armenian sentiments resulting from the genocide, resulting from the underlying sentiments and motivations that produce the genocide, continuing to exist and continuing to harm our communities. But one important aspect of this process of denial is the culture and veil of impunity that denial affords the perpetrators of genocidal crimes. So while we see this impunity manifest itself in the perpetration of ongoing human rights abuses against Armenian communities in Turkey, we also see new groups in Turkey becoming the victims of genocidal atrocities, including the Kurds in eastern Turkey, northern Syria, and more recently now, with the new operation the Turkish government's initiated in northern Iraq, the Kurdish communities and the Yazidi communities in that part of the world too. So the ramifications of genocide denial aren't limited to historic debate. They are contemporary processes too. So when we conceive of genocide denial, we don't only think about the processes by which historic crimes are swept under the rug. We also talk about genocide denial as a contemporary process that accompanies the process of genocide perpetration today. And one example, and this leads into the formation of the Impact Media Institute, when we look at cases such as the persecution of the Uyghur community in China or the Rohingya communities in Myanmar, we don't see this presented in national media or government or civil society as genocide. We see often very euphemistic references to re-education or concentration camps or ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing as a term was actually popularized by the perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide, Slobodan Milosevic. So we're actually appropriating some of the language of genocide perpetrators in the way we try to whitewash and diminish the impact of what the term genocide means. So we do need to examine genocide denial in a contemporary context and understand that genocide denial is one of the major factors inhibiting our ability as communities, as advocacy groups, as nations to respond to contemporary cases of genocide perpetration. And that normalization of genocide denial is not something that is only perpetrated by state actors engaged in the act of genocide. The normalization of genocide denial is also something we see perpetrated by media in the United States today, or civil society organizations, or even the government. Denial doesn't necessarily mean the outright denial of a crime taking place. It can be silence on an issue. It can be the refusal to acknowledge the crime for what it is, which is genocide. And we, as I mentioned, these euphemistic terminologies we see applied to these cases is, on the whole, incredibly damaging when it comes to our ability to assess the situations on the ground and to respond to them. And there's no better example than Rwanda and the inability of the US to identify that case as one of genocide, which resulted in a huge degree of reluctance amongst the policymaking community here to intervene and try to ameliorate that situation as it was unfolding. So the Impact Media Institute was our attempt to try to address this issue, moving beyond the case of the Armenian genocide, but looking at the ways in which genocide denial manifests themselves at a global scale and how that affects all of the communities across the world, including our own, who've been affected by the process of genocide and the ongoing ramifications of genocide denial. So some of the core aspects of the work that we're doing as an institute includes providing comprehensive reporting on genocide in the world today. And what we've done has been to identify some at least 80 cases of active genocide denial or genocide perpetration occurring to this day, perpetrated across about 60 different countries. And I guess most shockingly is the fact that of the 30 or 40 countries that are actively involved in genocide denial, approximately 65% of them are also involved in some form of genocidal violence, whether that be the actual extermination of a victim group or the imposition of a systematic discrimination against those target groups. So we see genocide denial as actually an incredibly problematic issue when it comes to the enabling of future crimes against humanity, in large part due to that impunity that it affords the perpetrator states that we've seen. The Impact Media Institute is also working to build capacity in the media to report on atrocity crimes, because in large part, the reason the media has been unable to address these issues is because there's simply a lack of knowledge and a lack of capacity on how to identify these cases when they appear in the world. Sometimes there are cases that might seem like they are that they should be classified and identified as genocide. The media simply isn't doing so because there's so much misleading information out there, particularly that put out by the perpetrator states themselves to obscure public understanding and knowledge. And on the Armenian front, we've actually worked very closely in the past with publications such as the New York Times, Boston Globe, The Guardian, and a few other major national publications to establish editorial guidelines when referencing the Armenian genocide to ensure we don't see the parenthesized genocide label come into play where we start to dispute the veracity of these historic facts. And then I suppose the public aspect of the work that we're doing is our Coalition Against Genocide Denial. And we're very proud to count ICANN amongst our inaugural supporters. Our Coalition Against Genocide Denial now has about 50 members actively participating from human rights organizations, community-based organizations, academics, elected officials, and a range of other civil society stakeholders who have all pledged to expose cases of genocide denial in the world today, highlight and identify modern cases of genocide perpetration, and also put pressure in whatever way we can as a coalition of organizations to ensure that our elected officials, our civil society representatives, and primarily our media representatives are able to accurately categorize and classify genocide in the world today and provide no platform to genocide denial, because one of the worst aspects of genocide denial is how pervasive it is and how ubiquitous it becomes and how commonplace it is. And we need to be able to respond on all fronts to ensure that genocide denial is not able to be cultivated in our public spaces, because that results in this process by which we continue to strip communities that have experienced these forms of persecution of their agency, of their autonomy, of their cultural, political, economic rights by diminishing their experiences. So these three aspects, our comprehensive research, our media capacity building, and our coalition partnerships form the basis of what is the Impact Media Institute. Ultimately, as an organization, we believe that prevention has to begin with recognition, and recognition can only begin when we approach genocide denial in a holistic and comprehensive way, not on a case-by-case basis, not by identifying cases we deem worthy of constituting genocide, but understanding that genocide is this process. Genocide is something that, in its framing and foundation by Raphael Lemkin, was designed to include a broad spectrum of crimes designed to destroy and undermine communities, alienate them, and atomize them. So that's the work of the Impact Media Institute. And I have to thank Dylan, Rhonda, and all those involved in this seminar today for dedicating such attention to the issue of genocide denial. Unfortunately, it is one of the most overlooked aspects of the perpetration of genocide. But the more we start talking about it and sharing these experiences and understanding the ways in which genocide denial affects communities to this day is an incredibly important part of the process of combating that and preventing future genocides from taking place. So thank you very much for your time. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thanks, Alex. So you'll be hanging out with us for the rest of the broadcast, but I did have two quick questions. Number one, I have ICANN's signed pledge here, and I'm proud to say that we signed on to you early. Proud to be a partner with you. Anything that we can do to help you, you know, we're friends and allies in this effort. One quick question I had was what kinds of, you know, from the Armenian community, genocide denial really does kind of start with Turkey and other countries, Azerbaijan, with not recognizing the genocide. With the Holocaust, with the Jewish community, it's a little bit reversed. We see a different phenomenon in Eastern Europe. How are you guys at the Impact Media Institute and at the ANCA looking at Eastern Europe and how, you know, the Polish laws and other things like that are affecting genocide denial today, contemporarily?
I mean, absolutely. And this has been this concerning trend, particularly with the rise of nationalism in many of these Eastern European countries, where we've seen a sort of reversal on previous positions taken by these countries when it comes to reconciling with their histories. I mean, in the case of Turkey, there was never that process of reconciliation. There was never a process through which the Turkish public, let alone the government, were able to review their history and understand what happened. From the beginning, there was this process of denial. And like you mentioned, in the case of many of these Eastern European countries that were heavily affected by the Holocaust and the Second World War and the atrocities committed therein, that process of reconciliation and understanding has kind of gone backwards. And this is something incredibly concerning. I mean, one of the areas we look at through the Impact Media Institute and through one of our partnerships with the community on the ground in Europe today, the European Roma Rights Center, is looking at the way in which Romani communities that suffered as a result of the Holocaust are currently being persecuted in many Eastern European and Southern European countries, and how that has become this kind of manifestation of a history of these countries failing to reconcile with their own collaboration with the Nazi regime and their own inability to successfully integrate and reconcile with that history. But now we're seeing those processes that were once kind of confined to these communities overtly. Of course, there was always implicit anti-Semitism in these countries, very pervasive and prevalent, is now it's becoming more acceptable for these things to come to the forefront. And this is what we're talking about when we discuss the normalization of genocide denial. What was once seen as taboo, what was once rightly relegated to the fringes of public debate in these countries, is now being given a platform by some of the leading parties of these Eastern European countries. So when we talk about combating genocide denial and the normalization of genocide denial, it's those very processes we witness in Eastern Europe, the persecution of Romani communities and the resurgence of anti-Semitism the resurgence of a public form of anti-Semitism and the denial of history that accompanies those cases, we need to be very vigilant and responsive to.
Perfect. And then one more question from myself, and then we have a quick question for you from the audience before we get to our main program here. One of the big concerns within the Jewish community in relation to Holocaust denial or distortion or revisionism is how it perpetuates contemporary anti-Semitism. How are you seeing that in the Impact Media Institute? Are you seeing that in the Armenian community? Are you seeing it in other communities? Are you seeing increasing intolerance tied to genocide denial or distortion?
Absolutely. And I want to begin by saying that we actually classify Holocaust denial as its own form of genocide denial in our database. It's incredibly important because the state-sponsored Holocaust denial we see throughout the Arab world, throughout the Middle East, is so pernicious. It's something that deserves its own attention, especially when you see so many other countries overwhelmingly accept the reality of what happened. The fact that these pockets of resistance and objection can still exist kind of fuels that process by which it's all interconnected. When you look at anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and all these processes that result in the undermining of the right to self-determination for Israel. But we, of course, see this process of the resurgent, I guess we refer to as an Armenophobia or anti-Armenian sentiment, has also become very, very commonplace. To give a couple of recent examples, we saw just last week the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, convene a meeting in which they called for a renewed effort to deny the Armenian genocide, recognizing that the work of organizations such as the Armenian National Committee here in the US and elsewhere had been so successful in achieving justice. For example, the two resolutions that passed through the Senate and the House last year recognizing the Armenian genocide. We also see anti-Armenian sentiment propagated throughout Azerbaijan, where anti-Armenian sentiment has almost become institutionalized in the country. And the Council of Europe has actually done reporting there that has found that Armenians have been so negatively portrayed by government, media, civil society that an entire generation of Azeris following the end of the Soviet Union have now heard nothing but negative opinions of Armenians, and that's resulted in in the incitement of some violent crimes, including the killing of Armenians. One specific case saw the murderer of an Armenian soldier during a NATO Partnership for Peace training session in Hungary get arrested in Hungary for his crime for the murder, but was later extradited to Azerbaijan, where he was pardoned by the president, promoted in rank, provided back pay for the time he served in Hungarian prison, and lauded as a national hero, quote, killing an Armenian. So we see these forms, and Azerbaijan, by the way, is the only other country in the world that actively perpetuates Armenian genocide denial. So we do see these forms of genocide denial become so dangerous in the way they incite future crimes. And that's just one example. I mean, from the case of the ongoing anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East to Armenophobia in Turkey and Azerbaijan, and increasingly throughout the region, we've seen anti-Armenian sentiments expressed in places like Lebanon, where there is an established Armenian community. So that's something that we consider very concerning. But resurgent attitudes of this, I guess you could call it the dehumanization of communities that accompanies the process of genocide, has become, unfortunately, part and parcel of the way in which many nationalist regimes have started to cultivate a sense of identity in their countries today in relative to a certain other group. So it's something we also need to be very, very aware of and vigilant of in the way that we frame these issues and examine these issues.
All right, so let's just get to our last question here. We have just a minute here before we start with Grant and Sylvia. Eddie Zilber is asking, is it true that the U.S. State Department has refused to use the word genocide in reference to the murders of the Armenians? In fact, they forbade the use of the G word by the State Department verbally or in writing. Is that true, Alex?
So the short answer is yes. After we had the genocide resolutions passed through the House and the Senate last year, there was a directive from the State Department that denied the fact that the genocide took place. It refused to categorize what took place as genocide, in clear defiance of what was an overwhelming bipartisan decision by both houses of Congress. And we also saw recently the ANCA made a request to the Library of Congress to change reference to the Armenian massacres included in their records to the Armenian genocide. And their response was effectively along the lines of the question, which was that the State Department and the administration does not consider what happened to be genocide, and therefore has refused to refer to historic fact as genocide. So that is something that we are still facing as a community, despite the fact we saw recognition take place in Congress last year.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Alex. And Rhonda, you brought up a good point about Hitler's reference to the Armenian. Do you want to mention that before we let Alex go here?
Sure. It's my understanding that at some point during Hitler's reign, when asked about what he was doing in terms of the Jews and the Gypsies and everyone else, he said something along the lines of, "Who today talks about the murder of the Armenians? People won't remember."
Yeah, absolutely. And that was obviously a very pervasive view that was taken, not only held by Hitler, but an important note to make is that when the German Bundestag recognized the Armenian genocide back in 2017, not only did they recognize the crimes committed by the Ottoman Empire, they also recognized the crimes that the German Empire at the time was complicit in. So many of the military officials that went on to then lead the armed forces and take Germany in that direction throughout the 30s and 40s were born into this kind of military culture of complicity and impunity, resulting from those Ottoman era genocide against the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian communities. So it was definitely an undertone of the entire process through which the Nazi regime justified the mass slaughter of the Jewish population of Europe.
Great, thanks, Alex. Well, let's get on to Grant and Sylvia. You'll hang out with us?
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much.
Perfect. So just wave your hand at me, and we'll bring you back in if you have a question. And we will bring in Grant and Sylvia. Thanks again, Alex.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, Rhonda, let's get ready for...
You got this. You got this.
All right. We have to switch up our logos there. All right. So thanks again to Alex. So now we'll bring in Grant Goshen. Hello, Grant. And Sylvia, thank you for waiting so patiently. So I'll let you two introduce yourself and start your story, and Rhonda and I will pump in with questions if we have them. So Grant, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Alex, and Dylan. Thank you so much. Sylvia's and my story is one that really needs to be brought to the attention of the world. It's a thoroughly egregious situation. Just to introduce myself, I'm a family man, I'm a businessman, and all of the Lithuania things that I do is in my spare time. So my time on this is limited, and in the very limited time I have, I've made some extraordinary discoveries that really need to be brought to the attention, and hopefully tonight we will, between Sylvia and myself, we will do some of that. Sylvia?
Hi. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm a high school teacher. I've been a teacher for 13, 14 years, and I was a journalist for 20 years before that, and I grew up in Chicago, Market Park, very Lithuanian community. And I'm a mother and involved in the Catholic Church. I'm also doing this in my spare time. So I guess that's it for my introduction.
Sylvia, you are a phenomenal, I want to say both of you, Grant and Sylvia, you're very courageous for doing this. I always say the easiest thing is to do the right thing, to do the good thing, but this is not necessarily, it's definitely a good thing, but not easy. And you're both very brave for telling your stories. I do want to mention very quickly, one of the things that we've done in preparation for this broadcast is set up a special landing page which tells your story, both of you, israelusa.org/genocide. So those of you who are watching, go ahead and check it out after the broadcast. And we have links, Sylvia and Grant, to your pages and also to news articles that go more into depth about your stories. So if I could And again, we'll make this very easy. It's a conversation. It's just the four of us here, and a lot of people watching, by the way. So it's very good. So don't be nervous. Don't be nervous. So Grant, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? Tell us your story.
I grew up in South Africa. 3 of my grandparents had survived the most horrendous horrors before they got to South Africa. And I grew up in an environment where Black people were being persecuted. My family was on the left of the left. They were political activists. I had a number of relatives that were in prison for what were called political crimes. I had an aunt that was in a cell on the one side of Mr. Mandela. I had an uncle that was in the cell on the other side of Mr. Mandela. So I grew up with a strong awareness of the need for protecting the innocent from the oppressor. My grandfather used to tell me stories about Lithuania, and it was an absolute fascination. South Africa presented the Soviet Union as the ultimate evil, and of course they had come from behind the Iron Curtain, and it was fascinating. So when Lithuania was liberated from the Soviets, I was one of the very first tourists that went to Lithuania, and I engaged with the Lithuanian government, and I took an active interest. I started restoring Jewish cemeteries in Lithuania. I started engaging politically with Lithuanian officials, and I started to learn. And on one of my very many trips to Lithuania, I stood over one of the death pits. There were 3 death pits in my grandfather's village. And I was standing over one of the death pits with an academic, and I said, you know, we know what happened, but who pulled the trigger? Who gave the order to actually murder my relatives? And the academic said to me, it was a man by the name of Jonas Noreka. So I was okay. So I came back to the United States and I wanted to learn more about it. And I learned that in 1984, before Lithuania regained independence, Noreka was exposed, and the German government acknowledged that he was a significant perpetrator, that he was in command of the area in which my family resided, and that he was the perpetrator. There was no question about who had done what. And so then I started learning more about it, and I found out that Noreka was one of the greatest national heroes of Lithuania. And I thought, wow, okay, they can't know about this. They must have made an error. So I thought, all I need to do is contact them and tell them, look, guys, you've made an error. This isn't a good guy. This was a monster. Take down the monuments and, you know, tell your people he was a monster. So I started contacting them, and there was just no engagement. There was just a refusal to have any conversation. Move it forward a few years. I mean, this is going on for year after year after year, me telling them and telling them. And in 2015, the mayor of the capital city in Vilnius took down some Soviet statues. And they weren't dedicated to a specific hero. They were representational artistic statues. And that's when I said, okay, if you're taking down Soviet statues, you can take down Nazi statues. So I contacted the mayor of Vilnius and I said, hey, you know, you've got these monuments in your capital city in places of absolute pride. These were bad people. And There are a lot of monuments in Lithuania for Holocaust perpetrators. There are a lot of Holocaust perpetrators honored as national heroes in Lithuania. And there was silence. And I said, you know what, this can't be. I'm not going to stand by and allow this to happen without voicing this. So I developed a legal strategy. I was so angry that they'd fobbed me off for so many years and they'd lied to me for so many years. I wanted to get them on record. So I started writing legal letters and I began litigation. In the process, I found out who Sylvia is. And my litigation has gone absolutely nowhere. In fact, in preparation for this conversation today, I made a list of my litigation, which is on my blog site, on my website. And it's truly shocking to see how much litigation I've gone through. And the level of denial, let's leave it at denial for a moment. Anyway, I'll cut this short. So one day, there's been a lot of publicity about the story. So one day I'm sitting at my desk in my office and this email pops up. And the email says, "Hello, Mr. Goshen. My name is Sylvia Foti. I assume you know who I am." And I knew exactly who she is. And my hands started shaking, my skin went clammy. And I was just sitting there. I was just in emotional shock when I received this email. And Sylvia said, "If you're willing to talk to me, I'd like to talk to you." And I needed to take my emotions down a couple of notches because my hands were literally shaking. So I responded to her, "I need a couple of days. Let's set up a specific time and let's talk." And I was deeply suspicious. I encountered so much dishonesty from the Lithuanian government and from Lithuanians. And let me just put a qualifier there. It's not all Lithuanians. The bulk of Lithuanians are really decent people that are horrified at what their government is doing. This is a segment of Lithuanian society. So I set a time with Sylvia and I said, "Okay, you can call me. Here's my number." And she called me and she said, "Mr. Goshen, I have read all of your research." And I was like, "Yeah, okay. And so now you're going to say it's all wrong." So then she says to me, "Your research is correct except for one item." So I said, "What is that?" She says, "You've missed approximately 10,000 of my grandfather's victims." And that's when the wall came down. That's when all my defenses came down. And with that, why don't I hand this to Sylvia and let her continue that story.
So I'm going to take this back 20 years, maybe even earlier. As I was telling you earlier, I grew up in a bubble of Lithuanianism. We only spoke Lithuanian in the house. I went to kindergarten. I couldn't speak English. My mother was very proud about that fact. And I grew up hearing what a wonderful hero my grandfather was, this wonderful hero from World War II. And part of my identity as a Lithuanian really revolved around this hero in the family. And even from childhood, I always heard the story of my grandfather, Jonas Noreika, backwards. I heard it from his death and how his horrible death. He died in a KGB prison. He suffered there for over a year. They tortured him. He was brought in the prison with 10 other men who were fighting against the Soviets for Lithuania's freedom. He was a lawyer. He demanded the Soviet judge that he represent these 11 men. He's so heroic. And he did. And at the end of it, of course, it was a show trial, and they executed him, and he died at the age of 36. So this was 1947. So before that, he was the head of Shola district during the Nazi occupation. And it was a very important position. And the version I always heard was that he was fighting against the Nazis every step of the way. And the Nazis wanted the Lithuanians to join the SS. And my grandfather was one of the men who fought the Nazis and stopped Lithuania, or forbade, Lithuania from joining the SS. And the Germans were so upset, they sent him into a Nazi concentration camp. So they sent him to Stutthof. And in Stutthof, he suffered for 2 years. Before that, he led an uprising against the communists in 1941. This was a 5-day uprising, and at the end of this uprising, the Soviets were left, and he played a big role in that. Before that, he grew up in a free and independent Lithuania, the most glorious time of Lithuania. That's when he met my mother, or he met my grandmother, and he had my mother. So I was extremely proud of hearing everything about my grandfather, Jonas Noreka. My mother, in the meantime, had been working on a book about her father, and she'd been collecting all kinds of material about him since the 70s, at least. And in the year 2000, she had to go into the hospital again. She had diabetes and a bad back, and so she was always in and out of the hospital. But this time it was different. It was worse. And I went to visit her, and I could see that she did not look well. But I still thought she would get out of it. And she took my hand and she said, "You have to write the book." And I thought, there's no way. No. The reason she's asked me to do this is because she knows what's happening to her, and I was not ready to accept that. And B, it was a lifelong project of hers. This was a big dream of hers to write this about her father. Like the whole Lithuanian community expected her to write this definitive story of her father. So she's waiting for my answer, and I'm looking out the window. It's a cold January day in Chicago, and I'm thinking about it, and I sort of was making a bargain with God, and I said, I'll say yes, but she'll get out of the hospital and she's going to write the book anyway. So I said yes. And the next day she went into a coma. And within 2 weeks, she had died. And she died on February 4th, 2000. So I was stuck with this deathbed promise. And in my grief, I thought this will be a way to connect with my mother and the homeland and learn more about my heritage. So I began to embrace the project. And I went to where my mom was living, and she had all kinds of materials on him. She had, 3,000 pages of KGB transcripts, 77 letters he wrote from the Stutthof prison to my grandmother, a fairy tale he wrote for my mother, just all kinds of, and these bookshelves behind me are all the material I had brought over here from her house. So I started digging into it, and then about 5 months into it, it was like July, I went to visit my grandmother. My grandmother had survived my mother. And she asked me about the book. How's the book going, Sylvia? And I said, what you did's fine. It's going fine. And, you know, I'm young. I won't let it go the way Mom did. You know, I'm working on it right now. I'm getting through the information. I'll get it done. She looks at me and she says, don't write the book. Just let history lie. And I thought, why are you saying this? What is going on? Of course I'm going to write the book. And she wouldn't give me an answer. And I said, but I promised Mom I have to write the book. And she just turned over in bed and faced the wall. And that was the end of it. And I thought maybe she was trying to give me a pass. You know, it was a big burden for my mother. My mom kind of had become a bit of an emotional wreck over the project. And I thought maybe she was just trying to spare me. That's what I thought at the time. So now my grandmother died within about 2 weeks after that. And they both wanted to be buried in Lithuania. So we take their cremains. My brother and I flew. He lives in Los Angeles. We flew to Vilnius, and we had the funeral for them. This was in October 2000. And my grandfather at that time would have had a 90-year birthday. So the school named after him in Shukone, the director asked if my brother and I would visit the school to commemorate his 90-year memorial birthday. And we did. So we go up there, and all the school children are, you know, with flowers and greeting us. And it was, you know, a very beautiful reception. And, you know, we're feeling so wonderful coming here, and we're feeling so special at the school named after our grandfather. And it's before noon. The director offers us beer, which in Lithuania you can't refuse. And so we go into his office, and he has this scrapbook collection of just, you know, article after article on our grandfather, and I'm kind of flipping through it. And he said, so I heard you're taking over the project for your mother. You're writing the book on your grandfather. And I said, yes, I did agree to that. And he said, you're such a good daughter for doing that. Our country needs heroes. And I thought, okay, I'd like to ask you why you named the school after my grandfather. How did that happen? And he said, well, as soon as Lithuania got its independence, we had to get rid of that Russian name, and we had to give it a good Lithuanian name. And your grandfather was born in this town, and so his name came right up. It was a natural. And I said, oh, and I thought that would be the end of the story. And then he takes my brother and me to the side, and he whispers, do you know, I got a lot of grief over what the Jews said. And I said, what could the Jews possibly say about my grandfather? And he said, well, he was accused of killing Jews. And that was when my world crumbled. I needed to sit down. I couldn't believe this. I had to catch my breath. And he, he like pats my arm, and he says, but don't worry, all that is in the past. It's all over, you know, it's okay. And then somehow I got through the rest of the day. And that was the first time I heard about my grandfather. It's the very, very, very first time. I was 38 years old. And and I still considered it a rumor. I couldn't believe it. I was sure it wasn't true. And, you know, the show's about denial. I was in denial for about 10 years with this information. I just could not wrap my head around it. I thought it was not true. And then little by little, I started finding funny things about it, like red flags. And the granddaughter in me wanted to defend him and exonerate him. The journalist in me wanted to find the truth. And the reason we're here today is because the journalist won, and I found the awful truth. So that's sort of the beginning of the story.
Okay, so then when Sylvia contacts me and she says to me, "You've missed 10,000 of my grandfather's victims," I was still, yes, the walls came down, and I was, my suspicion went. But then she said to me, "Do you want to read my book?" And I'm very familiar with this history. So I said, yes, I would. So she emailed it to me, and I sat down on my sofa at 5 o'clock one afternoon. And I will tell you that I did not get up until I finished her book. It was compelling. It was shocking. It was horrifying, because everything that I knew and my years and years of research, she had it in her book, and she had more. And her book just peeled the layers of the fraud. And just people that I'd been in contact with that had been so thoroughly dishonest, with this charm and this wonderful warm demeanor. Of course we're going to tell the truth. Of course we care about the victims. And Sylvia just peeled it back, and she just laid it out. It was as horrific as it was to read. It was uplifting that finally truth was being told. And I have thanked Sylvia more times than I can count, and I will thank her again. Since then, Sylvia wrote a letter of testimony for one of my court cases. The Lithuanian government dismissed Sylvia as unreliable for the reason that Sylvia disagreed with her mother. And so they would not consider any of Sylvia's 20 years of research, because she was unreliable, because she disagreed with her mother. And we can go into that a little more. Sylvia, why didn't you tell them about the time that you met with the director of Lithuania's Genocide Center, who is tasked with investigating these issues?
So it was the year 2013. And I'm a high school teacher, so I could only go in the summer. And I spent 7 weeks in Lithuania. This is after I finally was over my denial, and I was really ready to look into it and go to Lithuania and talk to as many people as I could. I had hired a Holocaust guide. I didn't even know what a Holocaust guide was. You probably are familiar with it. It's someone who you hire in Lithuania to take you around sites where you think your relatives are buried. And a friend of mine, he's a journalist from the Sun-Times. He told me about this, and I had this crazy idea of hiring a Holocaust guide to take me to sites where I think my grandfather was involved in killing Jews. And his name is Simonas Dovidavičius. He had just passed away last December, but we had become very close. And he is the one who suggested I talk to the director of the Genocide Center, and I was beside myself. She's not going to talk to me. There's no way she's going to talk to me. He convinced me to call. She was very friendly and she was very warm, and she took me in and she talked to me. And we eventually got to this document that my grandfather signed to send all the Jews in the Shola region to Ghetto. And I asked her, how do you reconcile his heroism with this document that he signed when he was the district chief of Shola? And her answer was something like, well, it's very difficult to know what was in his heart and what he was thinking. and what he was psychologically going through when he signed that document. And I thought, but he signed it. That's his signature. As a result of the signature, all the Jews were rounded up and sent to Żagaty, and they were killed. And I guess her defense was, in his heart, he really loved the Jews. He must have been, I don't know what she was thinking, but I thought it a very strange answer. And I just left it at that.
Sylvia, can I, Grant, just before you pop in, I just want to ask a quick question. You talked about the moment you felt like there was a red flag. You felt that there was something that you didn't want to know. That kind of conflict between being a journalist and being a granddaughter. Can you describe that evolution a little bit more? I mean, because I think that, to me, that is one of the most compelling parts of your story. Most people, and I was going to say, most people would not have, like I said, have the courage or bravery to do what you've done. And I just wanted to get a sense, a deeper sense of that process for you.
It was a very long process. One turning point was way buried deep in my mother's archive. I came across, I'm going to show it now, this brochure that he wrote called Pakel Galvaliatove, Raise Your Head Lithuanian. And I looked at it, and it looked pretty innocent. And then I started reading it. You know, the author's Jonas Noreika, and it's written, it says Kaunas, 1933. So he was a 22-year-old man when he wrote it. And essentially it's 32 pages of why Jews are so terrible, why they're the foreigners who came into Lithuania. We can't buy any more products from them. Lithuania for Lithuanians, on and on and on and on. And it has a section for journalists, and it has a section for businessmen, and it has a section for farmers. And when I finally finished reading it, I wanted to burn it. The granddaughter wanted to burn it. And then I came back to it a couple days later, and I looked again, and it's even on here. It says, 22 metų vyrukas, 22-year-old young man. And this is my grandmother's handwriting. So my grandmother's like ghost appeared to me, and she's telling me he was just 22 years old. He was a hothead. There's nowhere in here that says to kill Jews. So this was my out. I took that as an out for a while. So I clung to that for a while. So that sort of was something. And then by the time I really changed my mind, again, in my mom's archives, she had this book, Masinės žudynės Lietuvoje, massive slaughter, massive murders in Lithuania. And I thought, oh, this is just another, World War II book or something. And I started reading. Well, I went to the index, and I see Jonas Noreika there. I'm like, okay, this is not going to be good. And then I opened it up, and, I find a couple of the things that he wrote. And one was that document where he sent all the Jews to Żagaty, the Żagaty Ghetto. And another one was confiscating all the Jewish property in the Shola area. So this was around 2010-ish when I finally found this. The first 10 years, I did all the easy stuff. I just went through all his heroic stuff. I went through the 3,000 pages of his KGB transcript. I looked at the fairy tale he wrote to my mother. That was so beautiful. He wrote beautiful love letters to my grandmother from the Stutthof concentration camp. So I kind of concentrated on all that stuff for about 10 years. While, I'm raising children and teaching. Like I said, this was all my spare time. So then when I went to Lithuania, I found, even more devastating evidence. And then it took me a long time to write the book, again, in my spare time. And by the time I finally thought I was ready, I put a website up. And I needed to get an agent, and I needed to build a platform. And within 1 or 2 days, like March 2018, something like that, I get an email from this Andrius Kulikauskas. And he's telling me that he's a researcher for this guy named Grant Goshen. And Grant Goshen is involved in a big lawsuit against the Genocide Center concerning my grandfather. And I think, Sylvia, you should talk to Grant. That would be a really good idea. And I was just shaking. I'm like, a lawsuit? The Genocide Center? I thought this was like a family story. Like, what is this? And who's this Grant Goshen? I mean, so it took me 6 weeks to get up the courage to send that email to Grant, because I finally talked myself into it by, I finally talked to myself and I said, who the heck are you writing this book for if it's not for somebody like Grant? So I thought he was going to yell at me and, my grandfather killed his family, and I was terrified. I was terrified. But I was gonna, I thought, I'm going to face it. And so I sent him that email, and then we talked, and I was going over my notes, and I just mentioned this to Grant today. I think it was April 20th. Do you know what April 20th is? The significance of April 20th in our whole conversation? It's Hitler's birthday.
And Sylvia told me that this morning, and I almost vomited. But that was the day that Sylvia called me, and I'll just digress for a moment, and we can talk about this. There's been so much intimidation. Sylvia and I both receive regular death threats. We receive hate mail. The intimidation by the Lithuanian government has been ugly, to say the least. And yes, that's the date that Sylvia contacted me. It was the first time we'd ever we'd ever been in contact. But the accusations are that Sylvia and I have been working together for years, and Sylvia and I have created this conspiracy. To the Lithuanian government, the documents are meaningless. The evidence is meaningless. Sylvia, in her book, called this one of the greatest cover-ups of the 20th century. When Sylvia said that, she only knew about her grandfather. She didn't know at that point about the multitude of additional Lithuanian national heroes that were also Holocaust perpetrators. So common, in fact, that I've actually questioned, was killing Jews a criteria for Lithuanian national honors? I don't believe that to be so, but it was that common that I actually asked myself that question.
Just to add to that, when I was doing my own research on my grandfather, I was coming across other names, but I said, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. I'm just going to focus on my grandfather. I'm just going to do his story. That's all I promised Mom. That's all I'm going to do. So I was very hyper focused on just him almost all the way through. But once the book was written, and once I started talking to Grant, I was kind of ready to hear more. I understand the denial. It's the shame of it is crippling. The shame of it is crippling. So I understand the denial.
Can you both, and Rhonda, if you have any questions, just here, I'll have your mic here. But can you both just kind of describe, or either one of you describe, the bridge between each of you had your research, each of you had your stories, then you connected. And you've described to a certain extent the response from the government of Lithuania. But can you talk a little bit more about how that interaction began? Grant, you described your lawsuits, and Sylvia, you described your interaction with the Genocide Center director. But can you go a little bit further and just describe how the story has evolved from those moments to today?
Sylvia, could I take this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've contacted the Lithuanian President's office multiple times, the Prime Minister, the Parliamentary Ombudsman, the Journalistic Ethics Department. I have filed 3 applications with the Lithuanian Public Prosecutor to charge the Genocide Center with Holocaust denial. If you looked at my listing of litigation, it is crystal clear what a universal wall of denial I have received for as many years as I've been at this. The Genocide Center publishes grossly false information. We've pointed it out to the government, and they don't respond. The intimidation that's been public has been pointed out to the Public Prosecutor's office, and they ignore it. In 2015, after I began this, in 2015, 19 of Lithuania's leading intellectuals, including their then member of parliament, member of the European Parliament, signed a petition. It was, if I remember correctly, the president of Vilnius University. These were the leading names in the country. And the Genocide Center responded. Genocide Center is the official voice of the Lithuanian government on genocide issues, that it was agents of the East, which is Russian agents, Jews, and other stupid people, this was a plot. There is no reaction. That was in 2015, 5 years ago. In a normal country, somebody that would have done that would have been fired within half an hour of issuing a public statement. We've brought it to the government's attention. Their response is, you didn't bring it in the correct amount of time. One of my actions went to the Ombudsman of the Parliament. The Genocide Center declined to answer. Then we went back and we said, okay, well, we gave them the supplemental information. We have proof. We sent it to their email address that they use, because we've had emails back from them from that address, and they say, no, that isn't our address, so the case gets closed. I mean, these are, if this was in a regular court of law, this would have been shut down in the United States in a month. Unfortunately, the situation that exists in Lithuania, the current president of Lithuania actually ran on this as his election platform, is that much of the judiciary is corrupt. Verdicts are purchased. Verdicts are called in. It's not even an open secret in Lithuania, it's just open. Since this president has come to power, there have been multiple arrests of judges for exactly this. And I can't say definitively that that's what's been on my case. It certainly appears that way. But there is a complete wall of refusal to look at the facts of the case, which is why ultimately my strategy is to get this out of Lithuanian courts and into the European court, where the facts will actually be heard. I'm sorry, Dylan, did I answer the question or did I meander?
You did. You were perfect. And I think there's kind of 2 points then that story gets us up to.
Yes.
One, you saw the question here. I'll pull it up again from Dina.
Hold on, I don't have my glasses, just 1 second.
I'll read it to you, it's okay. So recently there was a move by members of the Lithuanian parliament to declare Lithuania innocent of perpetuating the Holocaust. Please could Grant update us on the state of that. So you've now told the story about how you've tried to bring it to the government's attention, to the parliament, to the ombudsman and the Genocide Center. Now bring us forward to this moment with the parliament.
So in one of my cases, okay, so let me lead you through some history. In the 1300s, Lithuania was a grand empire. It was one of the central world powers, and the leader then invited Jews to settle in Lithuania. He wanted to turn Lithuania into an industrial center. And Jews came, settled in Lithuania, and were much of the intelligentsia. And at that point, they called Jewish Lithuanians, they called them Lithuanians. I mean, Jewish Americans are Americans, Jewish South Africans are South Africans, and Jewish Lithuanians were then Lithuanians. But time moved on, and they then defined, Lithuania became an ethnic linguistic state. In fact, the father of the modern state defined Lithuania as an ethnic linguistic state and said that Jews were foreigners. And that was the first independence in 1918. And the leadership of Lithuania in the 1930s, much like Adolf Hitler said in Mein Kampf, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do it, and then he did it. Much of the Lithuanian leadership said in the 30s, Jews are foreigners, Jews are not Lithuanians. They even in their government documentation, Lithuanians were Lithuanians and Jews were Jews or Jewesses. But no Jew could be a Lithuanian and no Lithuanian could be a Jew. They divided the state on ethnic grounds, and much of the leadership in the 30s were very open that they wanted an ethnically pure state. They said what they were going to do. They said Jews needed to be eliminated from the state. And then they eliminated Jews from the state. And there was a 6-week period in which it was an interim Lithuanian government. The murders started in Lithuania before the Germans arrived. The Soviets left. The wheels came off the wagon. Lithuanians started plundering and murdering. The Germans came in, but at that stage, they weren't really murdering yet. They started later, and Lithuanians began the murder. And leaders such as Noreika were there promoting the murders, and then they ethnically cleansed the country. So the position of the government is first the Soviets occupied, then the Nazis occupied. So Lithuania was just a victim, and Lithuania as a state is not responsible. So what they do is they void out everything in the 30s. They void out everything that Lithuanians did, and to them it's a couple of individuals. Well, if you say it's a couple of individuals, then it wasn't the Soviet Union that occupied Lithuania. It was a couple of Russian individuals that occupied. It wasn't Russians that did mass deportations. It was just a couple of Russian individuals that were doing the deportations. But this was their position, and they wanted to legislate it. Now, in one of my court cases, the government lawyer put that forward as a defense, that Lithuania as a state was not responsible. The Lithuanian Foreign Ministry put that defense forward in an article they published in South Africa a year or two ago, declaring that Lithuania was just a victim and not responsible. And this was the position of a member of parliament. When the foreign ministry said it, it didn't elicit much response. When the government used that as a defense in my case, there was no response. But when they announced that they were going to draw up a bill and present to Parliament exonerating Lithuania of the Holocaust, the international community did respond. And so that bill has not been presented to their Parliament. I don't know what the status of it is, but it was certainly not just from one member of the Parliament. It was from multiple levels of their government.
Okay, perfect. We're in overtime. And let me bring in Rhonda real quick. We're a little bit in overtime. Are you guys okay to stay a little bit longer?
Sure.
We have a lot of questions coming from the audience. So Rhonda, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? We'll bring you in.
Sure. My question may not be completely relevant, but I don't know. It's my understanding, and I think I have the right country, that 10, 15 years ago, the person who is the current or the most recent president of Lithuania actually worked in the United States, whether it was Department of Justice, Department of Energy, Department of
Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay. All right. I knew I would get through there eventually. I don't know what we can do with that information, but I remember meeting an attorney who just blithely mentioned that her cubicle was next to the cubicle of someone who was, at that point now a president of another state.
He was president, maybe 2 or 3 presidents ago.
Okay.
Adamkus. President Adamkus.
Okay. I have no idea how that could be used. I'm sure people, Grant thought about it, but that I wanted to throw that out there. Okay, and now let's get to some more real questions. Okay.
All right, so let's bring it in here. Here is one from Janice. Janice Berliner is asking, did you Sylvia, find out why the Lithuanian citizens, including her grandfather, found it acceptable to hurt the Jewish people who weren't bothering them? Where did this hatred come from? Their parents, the Catholic Church? Why is Lithuania so anti-Semitic? Is it because they're jealous of their jobs, their property owned? You touched on that a little bit earlier, but maybe just to answer Janice.
Yeah, I think that my grandfather grew up in an anti-Semitic society. And there was most Lithuanians were peasants. And many Jews were in this kind of the center of the town, the merchants, the artisans, the business people, the bankers, the lawyers, the university professors. And Lithuanians thought, well, how come we can't have these positions? How did we even allow this to happen? So that there was, and I even noticed this in 2013 when I was visiting. It's like 2 separate worlds. The Jews are used to be, really in their own separate, isolated world, and the Lithuanians were in their own isolated world. They didn't even speak the same language. And they called the Jews Litvaks. They didn't call them Lithuanians. And that was like brand new to me. I did not know all this. So some of this is just that, and the stories I heard the Holocaust story only from Jews. And I only heard the heroic, wonderful stories against the Soviets from the Lithuanians. And I'm like, how come nobody's putting these two together? And, if you were Jewish, you focused on the Holocaust. And if you were Lithuanian, you focused on Siberia, because the Lithuanians were sent to Siberia. And so I think that, the Jews were accused of being communists, all the Jews. And it got to the point where even the mothers and the grandmothers and the babies were communist spies. And they all had to be killed. And so this is something, you know, somehow in genocide, it's a mass hysteria that takes over, and you think you are doing good while you're doing evil. So I think he thought he was doing good.
So let me add a little bit to this. Lithuania regained its independence as an ethnic state, and Jews were guaranteed freedom and equality in the new state because Jews fought so much for independence. And there was even a Jewish ministry, and it lasted a few years, and things were good. And then there was a coup in 1926. And some ugly people started coming to power. And you move into the 30s, and Sylvia showed you her grandfather's pamphlet. There was a lot of Jew hate. There was, you know, some of the people that later became the biggest proponents of genocide started coming into leadership positions, and Jews started being excluded from government jobs, and Jews weren't allowed to open businesses on Sunday, so they had to be closed on Saturdays and Sundays. And Jews started being excluded from various segments of society and business and other licenses. And then came 1940 and the Russian invasion. And the Lithuanians talk about the deportations to Siberia. But in fact, the Jews were the wealthy, the intelligentsia, so Jews were deported to Russia in about twice the proportion of Lithuanians. But these ethnic nationalists used this opportunistically to say the Russians are Jews. So, and all Jews are communists. And then, but the Russians decimated Lithuanian Jewry in 1940. They closed down schools, they closed down institutions. Jews basically were not allowed to be Jews. So the Russians really persecuted the Jews in 1940, but nonetheless, Lithuanians said that everything that was going on was the fault of the Jews. And
they persecuted the Catholics too.
Most Lithuanians are Catholics.
I know, but they shut down all the churches.
Correct.
So you couldn't practice your religion.
Correct. That was Soviet. So this was blamed. It was blamed on the Jews, and then the propaganda coming from Germany via Lithuanian leaders is blame the Jews for absolutely everything. So when the Germans started approaching Lithuania, the Russians evacuated, and there was a void. And the people of Lithuania had truly been persecuted. And suddenly they were free to take revenge. Now, one of the things that happened when the Russians came in 1940 was mass confiscation of Jewish property. And they divided it up between Lithuanians. They distributed Jewish property between Lithuanians in a socialist format. And there was a lot of jealousy. That Lithuanian got this property and I didn't get anything. So suddenly here was an opportunity for everybody to go and take whatever they wanted and to murder at will. And the wheels just came off the wagon and the murders began. And these were Lithuanians that were doing the murders. I mean, at the peak of the murder, when the Germans really were in Lithuania and operating, there were only 95 SS responsible for murders when 141,000 people were murdered. 95 people can't murder 141,000 people. So the Lithuanians started doing the murders before the Germans, and then it was the Lithuanians that were identifying who was Jewish, bringing them in, taking them to the murder sites, and that's what happened.
So it's unbelievable. Just to kind of bring it forward to today, we have a lot of questions bringing it to today. A user is asking, isn't Lithuania a member of the EU? This makes their denial even harder to comprehend. Let's talk about Vilnius versus Brussels. What does that look like now, and what can it look like maybe with our assistance and maybe some assistance from some American officials?
Sylvia, can I take this one?
You have to.
Okay. So after the war, the Americans went into Germany and denazified Germany. And there were a lot of problems with denial. There were a lot of problems, but Germany has stepped forward and told the truth. The Russians occupied Lithuania and suppressed everything. So there was no discussion about what happened until 1990. I mean, the Germans were publishing this information about Noreka and so many others showing what had happened in Lithuania. But Lithuania was only liberated in 1990 to start thinking about this. They've had 30 years to think about it, and the denial is still is stronger today probably than it was before. And they are still a very scarred people. They're still a wounded people with a wounded psyche, and they have not come to terms with the fact that they were perpetrators as well as victims. The only thing that they can consider in Lithuania is their victimhood. Now this is moving. The young people of Lithuania are very different to the older generations. But unfortunately, there's a group in Lithuania that are at high levels of government and high levels of society that demand the narrative that Jews were guilty of whatever, and Lithuanians were innocent. Now, for every Lithuanian that's told me that their family saved a dozen Jews, there were 220,000 Jews that were murdered in Lithuania. If I counted all the Jews that different people have told me that their family saved, it probably would have come to 1 million. Okay, so maybe every family saved the same 12 Jews. There were 915 rescuers. The murdering, there was probably 20,000 people involved in murdering. There were probably hundreds of thousands involved in distribution of stolen property. The bulk of the population were bystanders. And in a time of extreme stress, most people are bystanders. There's very few active rescuers. So the 915 that rescued, one has to give them unbelievable kudos because it must have been extraordinary. After the war, those people had to remain silent because other Lithuanians would persecute Lithuanians that had rescued Jews, because this was going against their ethnic narrative of the state. I know of a couple of cases of Jews that survived, went back to Lithuania, went back to their home, and were then murdered by the occupants of those homes. So the murders didn't stop. The murders by Lithuanians didn't stop at the end of the Holocaust. So what you have today, what you have today is a very unusual situation. I personally do not believe that the average Lithuanian is anti-Semitic. There are massive incidences of anti-Semitism. They have this harvest festival every year where people dress up in these Jewish costumes with these huge noses and these huge ears, and they're carrying money, and just
Fat Tuesday, right before Lent.
correct, correct. So, the synagogue in Vilnius had to shut down for a couple of days because of security concerns. But Holocaust denial is the very essence of anti-Semitism. Holocaust revisionism is the very definition of anti-Semitism. But Lithuania is actively trying to reach out to Jews. This year, they named the year in honor of the Vilna Gaon. They issued stamps for him. They're trying to show a very progressive face. But there's two sides to the coin. Is Lithuania the state that has universally blocked truth about their perpetrators? Or is the state the one that's trying to attract Jewish tourism and business? Because they can't both be the same state.
Or to appear as a contemporary, modern European state.
They're not. If you look at the incidences of homophobia
But to appear that way, to whitewash their history and their actions to appear that way. And that's where I kind of want to, just to get back to the question of how do you reconcile this kind of trend of Eastern European countries, and we're focusing on Lithuania today, versus Germany and Austria, which have embraced their truth. And with Lithuania being a member of the European Union, how do we reconcile this conflict? And is there something that we can do, or with the EU?
I think what happened with Lithuania and the Eastern European countries is the occupation of the Soviet Union. No way you can underestimate that. The strength and the power and the horror of this totalitarian state over these Eastern European countries was horrific. At least that's how I was told living, in Chicago. And they could not have any religion. They could, no material goods. It was a totalitarian state, spies everywhere, spies in your own home. You could not study whatever you wanted. You could not do whatever you wanted. So this, Germany and Austria had the luxury of kind of analyzing their history and looking into it. And look, there's no way Lithuania even had that opportunity. I think now they are starting. Even before I jumped in, I think it was starting. But I think it will take time. Germany took a long time too. They really only started in the 70s and 80s, which is 30, 40 years after, and they were a free democratic state. So if we're comparing ourselves to Germany and Austria. So I do think it is a 30, 40 year process to take ownership and responsibility of the evil that is within you. I mean, this is at a very human level.
Exactly, correct. Look, there are, the foreign minister of Lithuania said that Lithuania has to come clean. Those were his words, and tell the truth. He was so repudiated in Lithuania for having said that. But he faces Jewish audiences when he comes to the United States and when he goes into Europe.
This is a Lithuanian foreign minister, you're saying?
Correct, Mr. Linkevičius. And I've never met him in person. I understand he's a very good, decent man.
Mr. Foreign Minister, if you're watching, and you come to Los Angeles.
Yeah, okay. So I do believe that he's a sincere and good man. But he's outward facing. Inward facing is what the Genocide Center does and what other branches of government do which is lie, absolutely. I mean, they have the most popular museum in Vilnius is the Genocide Museum. Sylvia's grandfather's name is engraved on the outside of their Genocide Museum.
Because that was the KGB prison that he died in.
Correct.
And was tortured.
Correct. But you have a significant genocide perpetrator honored on a museum called the Genocide Museum. So they have so inverted truth for so long that, and it's been taught so fundamentally in their education system, that at this point in time, how do you go to thousands of kids that have gone through the Noreka Secondary School? Primary, sorry. Thousands of kids that have gone through this Noreka Primary School and say, you graduated from a school named for somebody that probably murdered 14 to 16,000 Jews. I mean, how do you go to, imagine having a school called the Adolf Hitler School, and then the kids have no idea who he is, and then you go to these kids and say, okay, well, you know where you actually got your education from? The level of re-education that's going to have to go through that society is monumental. I actually don't know how they can do it at this point.
So Dina Gold has a couple of good questions here. I'll read them for you, Grant and Sylvia. She asks. I know we're at 90 minutes, guys, but we'll just ask these last few questions. Then and Rhonda, I know you're on the East Coast. I apologize. So Dina asks. I understand that, and Sylvia, you have to help me with this. Kaunas in Lithuania is going to be the European capital of culture in 2022. Can you tell us how this will impact Jewish issues?
Fabulous question. Dina, thank you. Okay, so this goes back to exactly what I was saying. They're trying to market as a civilized, progressive country while they are practicing gross Holocaust revisionism. So just like this year was a year to market to Jews for tourism and business, in 2022, they're going to market to the whole world as a capital of culture. But how does a society then say, even in 2020, we've lied to our population so much for so long? It's two sides of a coin, and I don't understand. So for a person that wants to go to Kaunas for that, they need to reconcile for themselves that this is the tourism promotion of the Lithuanian state versus this is what the Lithuanian state actually is. And then people actually need to reconcile and make a decision for themselves. Is this really the capital of culture? I explained to you a little while ago how Lithuanians were Lithuanians, Jews were Jews. Right now, the Lithuanian government is putting out all this material saying Jews were Lithuanians. Well, they've had to go back 700 years, 697 years, to find the time when Jews were Lithuanians, Lithuanians were Jews. It was one and the same. Everybody was just a Lithuanian. You know, these are marketing selling points.
What does it mean to be the European capital of culture? What is that?
I have no idea.
Okay. Is this like an Dina? If you're watching still, I hope you're hanging in there with us. Let us know in the comments. Is that an EU designation? Is there only one capital of culture each year?
I believe there's only one capital of culture, and it's for tourism promotion. They're trying to promote their country, as every country tries to do. So they're out there putting out as positive a message as possible. And the items that Sylvia and I are talking about have to be suppressed because they just cannot talk about this. Because how do they say, we have engaged in rampant Holocaust revisionism for years and years and years. They're in a tough position.
Well, part of the commitment of us here tonight is that we won't let it be suppressed. So so let's look at another question from Dina, and I'll read it. What is Lithuania doing to implement the 2016 ECRI recommendations to prevent public praise of Nazi collaborators? Is progress monitored? What sanctions are there for Lithuania non-compliance?
I will answer that question very simply. Go onto my blog and look at my list of litigation. So again, Dina, that was a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Look, the whole of the outside world knows the facts about Lithuania. The European Union has told them to stop honoring Nazis. Everybody, the State Department in the United States has told them to stop doing it, but they don't. Again, the Lithuanian foreign minister has publicly said that Lithuania needs to come clean, but he's the lonely voice. They have done absolutely nothing. And if you look at the list of litigation, you will see that it is a universal wall of denial and refusal to address the issues. So they're not doing anything to implement it.
Okay, great. So just to answer that question, Dina and Vladis also wrote to us. The European Capital of Culture was started in 1985. It's a cultural project in Europe and one of the EU's most appreciated activities. So that's good for Lithuania. But we'll make sure that they don't let this history be forgotten. We do have a few more questions that are more historical in nature, and I appreciate you guys. We still have a great audience hanging in there. Are you guys okay to take a couple more questions?
Sure.
All right, let's.
The dogs are crying. They want to go for a walk. I can hear them, but yes.
it's and I can see it. The sun is setting where you are, Grant. So we'll have to hurry up.
I'm fine.
So we have two questions here. One from Greta and one from Michelle. I'll go through them quickly and then I'll let you guys answer. So Michelle is asking Grant, how did your family leave in time? So I guess Michelle missed that. How did your family leave in time? And then Sylvia, who let your grandfather out of Stuttgart?
Do you want me to go first?
Go ahead, Sylvia, you go first, and Grant, I'll let you answer Michelle.
The Soviets came and let them out. He was one of the first to be able to leave Stuttgart. The Jews were cremated, but he was among the first group that was be able to, Germany lost the war, so Soviet Union won, and he was able to leave. And when he left, he was shortly after conscripted by the Soviet army. So he was in the Soviet army for a few months, and then I don't know this part. I don't know. This part's still a mystery to me. Then he was let go, and then he went to Vilnius, and then that's when he started this underground movement. But then the KGB caught him, and then he was in the KGB prison.
Can I just add to that, because it's a critical component of this. So the Holocaust in Lithuania had been pretty much completed by the end of 1941. The Wannsee Conference in Germany to implement the final solution was only in January 42. So Lithuania's Holocaust was done before Germany implemented theirs. Then you move ahead to, and Noreka was the head of this area. You move ahead to 1943, and the Soviets are now approaching, and the Germans are getting afraid. And Noreka is one of those nationalist leaders that wants independence for Lithuania. The German agenda was Lebensraum, expanding the living space. So they had never intended to give Lithuania independence. But Noreka was a nationalist that was going to fight for independence. So they arrested him and they kept him in Stutthof as a political prisoner, but the term was actually an honored prisoner.
Well, that came 6 weeks later. I mean, and he was arrested for stopping Lithuanians to join the SS. And he and 46 other Lithuanians were taken as hostages to Stutthof. And in the first 6 weeks they were there, they were treated horribly, like everybody's treated horribly in a concentration camp. But after 6 weeks, there were like 25 remaining who survived cholera and the beatings and the tortures and the work. Then they became honorary prisoners, and then it became like there was even a higher status that they got, and so they did not have to work. They still did not get the food, but they got their own beds, they got their own sheets, they got their own barracks. They got a lot of perks, for a concentration camp. They were the aristocrats within a concentration camp.
But Sylvia, can you tell them how that came about?
We don't know. That is also Himmler created it, and Himmler gave them that status. But I don't know why. We can only guess. But I don't know why.
Okay. So Noreka's in Stutthof for nationalistic reasons, not for anything to do with murdering Jews. So I just need to make that point clear. So what the Lithuanian government does is they take extraneous facts and they insert it into a conversation. So they say things like Noreka was sent to Stutthof for resisting the Nazis, to try and imply that he was there rescuing Jews when he'd already completed his genocide. So it's this constant effort to go around.
It's complicated. It's very complicated.
Very complicated. But it's exactly what Alex was talking about at the beginning of this program.
So we're going now. We're approaching almost 2 hours. I just want to kind of wrap it up. Marvin, and let me bring in Rhonda real quick. Marvin is asking about your book, Sylvia, and I know Rhonda wanted to go ahead and ask your question. I think that'll wrap us up. And before we get to the final question, I do want to suggest that perhaps, we have had such amazing engagement on this. We may want to think about maybe doing a more regular meeting about this. Maybe a monthly town hall where we can update. There have been a lot of developments. There have been a lot of development. We haven't even spoken about, for example, Sylvia, you were honored by many cities, the city of West Hollywood, for example, in Los Angeles. Beverly Hills passed a resolution condemning the Lithuanian government for its actions in engaging in this denial and distortion. Grant, you were honored by the city of Beverly Hills. So I just want to say that perhaps we should make this an ongoing conversation. This is not this is a developing story. Yes. And we have work to do. And it seems like we have work to do before 2022. Maybe before. So Rhonda, I'll let you take it from there, and then we'll say goodnight to everybody.
Sure. I have quick questions for both of you. And I guess it's been asked before, but Sylvia, where can we read your book? Where can we buy your book? And Grant would be, who is supporting or funding you?
Sylvia.
So my book will be coming out in Spanish, hopefully in August, by HarperCollins, Mexico. So it's coming out in Spanish first.
Do you want to talk about that for a second, the Mexico connection?
No.
Okay.
Let's let that out when it comes.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then the English version is coming May 2021. And the title today is, it keeps changing, The Nazi's Granddaughter, How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal.
Wow.
So we got to wait a year.
And I will tell you that I have read it, and it is compelling. It is if I knew nothing about the story, Sylvia's book is one of the most compelling texts I have read. As I said, I did it in one sitting. So, Rhonda, to answer your question, the answer is nobody. I'm doing this entirely on my own. I have no institutional support. Dylan has been a moral support, and Dylan is, I will tell you that without the advice of ICANN, we would not have been able to take it as far as we have. But ICANN is the totality of the moral support that I have, and I'm funding this entirely on my own and without any institutional advice or backing.
Which means we have a lot of work to do together. We have good friends with the ANCA. Thank you again, Alex, for kicking us off and really putting this all in context. Maybe the ANCA can host a session with Sylvia and Grant and have the Armenian community hear their story. Rhonda, I want to thank you and the AAJLJ for co-hosting this with us.
Thank you for doing this work.
Absolutely, and let's work together. And I want to thank our viewers. You really hung in there. This is one of our longer broadcasts and probably one of our most engaging and most watched. So I appreciate you all for hanging in this long. So with that, we will. I'll let you all say goodnight.
Thank you.
Feel free to keep in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rhonda, here, visit AAJLJ online, aajlj.org. Thank you again for hosting us. And visit. What Alex? What is ANCA's website?
ANCAWR.org.
ANCAWR.org. Good friends. Good friends. All right, you guys. Thank you all again. It's really good to seeing you.
Be safe.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll do this again. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.